is an overview of the short story The Wasteland by Alan Paton. The where, the when, the what, and the who. Where? The story is set in an unnamed town in a dysfunctional society. The setting is most likely to have been either inspired by or based on author Alan Paton's experience of his South African homeland during the apartheid era, a period when conventional social and familial connections or bonds were ruptured. The bleak social degradation that prevails in the town where the protagonist lives is clearly conveyed from the outset of the story, when we learn that the thing feared by all is to be waited for by young men. This information immediately alerts the reader to the fact that something is seriously wrong. Normally, young men and women should represent any society's hopes for the future, and generally they should treat their elders with respect. Thus, the fact that the older man is aware that everyone is afraid of being attacked by a gang of young men warns us that this aspect of a civilized society has been corrupted. In South Africa, apartheid lasted from 1948 until the early 1990s, and during this period, poverty and crime were rife, especially in the townships, the areas where the non-white South Africans were obliged to live. The specific setting for the majority of the story's action is the eponymous wasteland, the dark and frightening junkyard into which the man flees for his life, pursued by a gang of unscrupulous youths. According to one dictionary definition, a wasteland is somewhere that is barren or uncultivated, an ugly, often devastated or barely inhabitable place or area, or something, such as a way of life, that is spiritually and emotionally arid and unsatisfying. The junkyard ticks many of these boxes, as does the society in which this story is set. Thus, it becomes increasingly clear as the story goes on that the wasteland is a metaphor for the lawless, amoral, and violent society in which our protagonist lives, possibly explaining why he is carrying a heavy stick when coming home from work with his wages. When? This short story was published in 1961, and given the content matter, the fact that Alan Paton was South African and an anti-apartheid activist, and the fact that 1961 was during the era of segregation between people of colour and white people in South Africa, it seems reasonable to assume that the story is set around the time of its publication, although in some ways it is timeless. The action takes place one evening when the protagonist is returning home from work, and there are references to the lights of the bus contrasting with the dark street and the darkness in the wasteland. These recurring references to darkness create a suitably sombre mood for the shocking, tragic events that follow. What? There are three key themes explored in Paton's thought-provoking and disturbing short story: social breakdown, poverty and violence, fear. Social breakdown. A dysfunctional, broken society is a key issue in The Wasteland. This short story shares its title with a poem by T.S. Eliot which shares a similar bleak theme. The society in which the characters live can be considered broken in that normal social bonds such as respect, care and compassion that should exist between humans have been ruptured, in this case presumably as a result of segregation or apartheid. The extent of the breakdown is evident from the fact that young men are ambushing people of their parents' generation, and indeed Freddy has even conspired to betray his own father in his desperation to obtain money. We learn early on in the story that in this society, mercy was the unknown word. This short, blunt sentence hits the reader hard. The word mercy suggests positive human emotions, such as compassion and sympathy. Yet we are being told that this word is unknown in this society, suggesting that the people who live here are devoid of such caring emotions. It does not sound like a safe place, so we fear for this man's safety, as indeed does he. The fact that the protagonist is a hard-working and law-abiding man who does not deserve to be a victim of violence and thuggery means nothing in an amoral society such as this. A further example of the moral decay is that in a normal, more civilised society, he might have been expected to be able to seek sanctuary in a religious building. However, the convent is said to have a high wall and a barred door that would not open before a man was dead, His only hope is thus to try to escape by running into the wasteland of the title, a junkyard full of wire and iron and the bodies of old cars, which is a metaphor for the society. The personification of the wrecked cars here, comparing them to dead bodies, adds to the mood of hopelessness and despair. Perhaps the most telling indicator of the lack of compassion remaining in this broken society comes at the end of the story, when the young men simply lift Freddy's body and swung it under the lorry. They make no attempt to remove their friend's body to return it to his family or bury it. Perhaps more telling still, neither does his heartbroken father. Thus, this short but compelling story explores how social dysfunction within a society impacts the individuals who live within it, especially the less well off. It does so by showing how poverty leads to a group of young men engaging in criminal behaviour, and that as a result of their lawlessness, a law-abiding man is forced to resort to violence himself. In other words, everyone suffers when a society is divided by apartheid and racism and begins to break down, resulting in poverty and violence, pitting communities, families, and even family members against each other. Poverty and violence. The themes of poverty and violence, as well as the link between them, are also explored in this depressing short story, which opens with a gang poised to attack the protagonist of the story on his way back from work. What the young men wanted from him are the wages that are weighing heavily against his thigh. The older man fears for his life, as he knows that nothing counted against that. In other words, that the ruthless young men will do whatever it takes to get his money. This reference to money early in the story suggests that poverty, rather than merely greed, is an issue in this society, and that people are resorting to theft and violence out of desperation. As soon as he alights from the bus, the man realises he is in danger, having been cornered, with his only hope of escape, the bus, which is already disappearing. The bus is described at this point using the striking simile, like an island of safety in a sea of perils. Paton skillfully uses other language techniques to describe the man's traumatic experience as he flees through the wasteland of the junkyard. The word choices of knife-edged piece of iron, grotesque shape of wire, and ripping vividly portray the setting in which he finds himself, suggesting that this environment is hostile and violent, just like the society as a whole. And that's before we even factor in the young men intent on robbing and possibly killing him. Other language used to highlight violence includes the onomatopoeia of crashing in the phrase brought his stick crashing down on it, and the reference to the heavy stick which the protagonist brings down on the head of his pursuer. These clearly convey the desperation of the man as he fights for his survival. Even he, a law-abiding man, is forced to resort to violence, albeit in self-defence, in this broken society where extreme poverty pushes people to the edge, and even normally law-abiding citizens eventually engage in amoral behaviour. Paton seems to be suggesting that abiding by the law is almost impossible, no matter how decent a person you are, if you live in a society that is dominated by poverty and violence. The desperation of living in poverty is also referenced near the end of the story, when a member of the gang finds the body on the ground, and we are told that he fell to cursing before saying, "There's no money here." Money is thus clearly the gang's motivation for attacking the man, and nothing else matters to them, because their lives are dominated by poverty. Fear. Paton also explores the theme of fear in the wasteland. There can be no doubt in the reader's mind about the terror that the protagonist of the story experiences as events unfold. Moreover, even before his fear is described to us in compelling language, there is a reference in the first paragraph to the thing feared by all, namely being waited for by young men, and this suggests from the outset that everyone in this society lives in fear. His use of evocative language techniques throughout the story depicts the hunted man's distress, such as the use of adjectives in the statement, his fear was great and instant. There's also the word choice of plunged blindly to describe his movements, voiceless and gasping to describe his inability to shout loudly when he tries to shout, help me, and the reference to his lips tasting sweat and blood. Imagery is also highly effective in conveying the man's visceral fear. For example, his very entrails seemed to be coming into his mouth, and his heart was like a wild thing in his breast. Through this combination of word choice and imagery, Paton portrays the physical effects of raw fear on the man in a powerful and memorable way, before and during the chase through the decaying and unforgiving wasteland. Who? The protagonist. We do not ever learn the name of the story's protagonist, nor what his job is or where he lives, although the story is told from his perspective in a fixed third-person narrative voice, so we are privy to his thoughts and, later, his intense emotions. What we do discover about him is that he appears to be an older working man who has a wife and family, and that he earns money by holding down a job to support them. As he is paid in cash, it's possible that the job involves manual labour. At the start of the story, when he is coming home from work in the dark one evening and gets off the bus, the man is immediately aware that he is in danger, which engages our sympathy for him early in the story. Through Paton's characterisation of the protagonist, we learn that he is a decent person, as his first thought is what will happen to his family should he be murdered. Indeed, when confronted by the gang of young men, he thinks his wife could be made a widow, his children made fatherless. This engages our pity for the protagonist early on, and our concern for him only increases when, unable to get back on the bus or access the nearby convent, he is forced to run out into the eponymous wasteland to escape from the gang. The protagonist's devotion to his family, which we learn about early in the story, helps us understand why he is so distraught at the end of the short story upon learning that not only has his son conspired against him with the gang to rob him, direct speech of Freddy said one, "Your father's got away," but that also, in his desperate attempt to defend himself, he has unwittingly killed his own child. This tragic, ironic twist emerges near the end of the story when one of the gang members, bending over the body, bluntly announces, again in direct speech, "It's Freddy. He's dead." This would already be an unbearable scenario for any parent, but worse is to come when the gang swings the body of his son under the lorry where he is hiding so that it touched him. His anguish in the final lines of the story is therefore understandable and is clearly conveyed when he says to himself, using biblical language, "People arise, the world is dead," before emerging from under the lorry and walking heavily out of the wasteland, leaving his son's body behind just as the gang had done. The protagonist in The Wasteland undoubtedly cuts a tragic figure, an unfortunate member of a poverty-stricken, violent society, even though by the end of the story we know that he too has resorted to violence and done the unthinkable by killing his own child. We still feel pity for him, for we have learned enough about him in this short story to know that hitting out with his heavy stick was the act of a desperate man living in a broken society. Freddy. As we discover at an important moment towards the end of the story, Freddy is the protagonist's son, and shockingly, he is one of the young men who are waiting to attack the protagonist when he gets off the bus after work. We eventually become aware of this fact at the same time as his father does, when one of the gang members shouts out, "Freddy, your father's got away." This information must be heartbreaking news for the protagonist, as he realises that his own son has betrayed him by telling the gang when he will be coming back from work with his wages in his purse. The situation quickly deteriorates, though, when it becomes clear to the protagonist that when he lifted the heavy stick and brought it down on the head of his pursuer, the head in question belonged to Freddy. When describing this key incident, Paton uses vivid language. The man crumbled to the ground, moaning and groaning as though life had been unjust to him also. While initially it might seem odd to suggest that the gang member has any right to feel that what is happening could in any way be unjust, after all, attacking an innocent man is hardly a fair thing to do, the word choice of unjust here is thought-provoking. For if we try to put ourselves in Freddy's position for a moment, we realise that perhaps he and the other members of the gang are desperate for money because of the abject poverty in which they live. Paton's message seems to be that in a broken society, people are driven to behave in extreme ways in an attempt to survive, thus underlining the link between poverty and violence. Interestingly, Freddy is the only named character in the story, which humanises him and makes it all the more hard-hitting that neither the gang nor his father removes his body from under the lorry when they leave the wasteland. The plot of The Wasteland is deeply disturbing, but it also helps us to understand the complex social and political situation that Paton understood only too well from his South African homeland, a society which is segregated or divided, and where the extreme poverty caused by policies enforcing such segregation inevitably leads to conflict, not only between white people and people of colour, but also within individual communities and even in extremis, as is the case here, within individual families. The other gang members. As outlined in the where and when sections above, the backdrop of apartheid, social division and poverty against which this story is set influences the actions of the characters and our reaction towards them. Desperate people can behave in desperate ways, so Paton's story is thought-provoking and may even encourage the reader to wonder how harshly to judge Freddy and his friends. The actions of the gang are undoubtedly violent, criminal and to be abhorred. Yet, we should also consider the nature of the society in which these young men were living, which might go some way to explaining their behaviour, whilst absolutely not condoning it. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you found it useful. See you next time. In our other video on The Wasteland, we look at key quotes from the story. If you found this or any of our other videos useful, it would be great if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thanks for your support.